You know that feeling when you just you hit an absolute wall of exposition on like page one of a book.
Oh, yeah. The ultimate reading roadblock.
Right. And the Begats at the very beginning of the New Testament are completely notorious for this. You know, Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob, and it's just this giant block of names.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It is, and most people just completely skim past it to get to the good stuff, you know. But the notes you sent us on Marc Bates's essay, I think it's called Genesis of Genealogy.
Yeah, that's the one.
Right. Well, those notes argue that skipping that list is actually a massive mistake. Because hidden inside that seemingly boring family tree is, well, it's a masterfully engineered blueprint.
It really is. It's foundational.
So our mission today, you know, for this deep dive into your sources, is to decode the hidden architecture of the Gospel of Matthew. Because it turns out this book isn't just a simple biography of a rabbi.
No, not at all.
It functions as this really complex bridge between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. And it's secretly structured to mirror the 5 books of Moses to present a brand new covenant. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, we have to start by adjusting our expectations of what a genealogy actually was in the ancient world, because when we read a family tree today, we expect a strict biological census.
Like a DNA test.
Exactly, like a DNA test printed out on paper, where every single branch is accounted for with absolute bureaucratic precision. But ancient genealogies, or Toledat, they operated on a completely different frequency.
Right.
They established covenantal continuity and legal standing for a community. They were telling a theological story, you know, about a person's place in the grand scheme of history.
And Matthew signals that he's telling a very specific, like, cosmic story right out of the gate. Because the very first phrase in his original Greek text is Biblos Geneseos, which translates directly to the book of the Genesis.
Right. And that phrase alone is a flashing neon sign for a biblically literate audience in the first century.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, it echoes the exact phrasing used in the ancient Greek translation of Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 5. So Matthew is telling his readers from the very first syllable that they are reading a new creation account.
Wow.
Yeah. Jesus is being introduced as the last Adam. He is positioned as the figure who will, you know, succeed where the first Adam failed, initiating the restoration of a completely fractured cosmos.
So he sets up this incredibly grand cosmic stage, and then he does something with the math that immediately trips up modern readers. Because he structures this family tree into 3 distinct, perfectly balanced sections of 14 generations.
The 14-14-14 pattern.
Right, 14 from Abraham to King David, 14 from David to the Babylonian exile, and then 14 from the exile to the Messiah. But to make this beautiful symmetry work, he literally leaves people out.
He does.
He just completely skips over historical kings like Ahaziah, Joash, Ahaziah, and Jehoiakim.
Yeah.
They just get cut from the official list. And at first glance, that feels a bit like, I don't know, fudging the numbers.
Yeah, it feels like cheating.
Like he was just manipulating it to make a neat pattern work.
And it bothers people who want that strict modern census we talked about. But we have to look at the literary intention behind it, because in Hebrew Gematria, which is a system where letters possess numerical value.
Right, A equals 1, B equals 2, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Well, the consonants of King David's name, which are Dalet, Wa, Dale, they add up to exactly 14. It's 4 plus 6 plus 4.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So by manipulating the generations into groups of 14, Matthew is stamping a Davidic watermark deeply into the structural math of the text itself.
I look at it kind of like a modern documentary director editing a film. You know, they might cut out repetitive or secondary footage to create a tight thematic highlight reel. The director isn't lying about the history. They're making a highly curated point about who the main character is and what actually matters in their story.
That analogy captures the mechanism perfectly. It's a theological highlight reel. And those 3 epochs he highlights, Abraham to David, David to exile, and exile to Messiah, they tell the complete story of Israel's covenant. But you really have to pay close attention to how he frames that 3rd epoch, the exile.
Right, because historically speaking, the Jewish people came back from Babylon hundreds of years before Jesus was born.
Yes, they did.
I mean, they rebuilt the temple. They were physically back in their homeland. So why is the period leading up to the Messiah still categorized under the exile?
Because Matthew is making a really profound theological claim about the spiritual state of the nation. I mean, yes, the physical return from Babylon happened, but the true exile, that spiritual rupture between God and the people, the ongoing domination by pagan empires like Rome, the absence of a reigning king from David's line, and crucially, the lack of God's unmediated glory in the rebuilt temple.
Well, it was basically still empty.
Exactly. None of that ended just because they rebuilt some stone walls. The true exile only ends when the Messiah arrives. I mean, Matthew 1:21 says Jesus will save his people from their sins. So the underlying guilt and spiritual fracture that caused the exile in the first place is what actually needs fixing, not just the geopolitical occupation.
Okay, so he breaks modern mathematical expectations to stamp this Davidic post-exilic theme onto the list. But he also deliberately breaks the rules of ancient registries by inserting 5 specific women into this lineage.
That's a huge shift.
Right, because in a culture that traced legitimacy strictly through the males, isn't throwing non-Jewish or, socially complicated women into an official royal record a massive PR risk.
It really is.
If I'm a first-century reader, I'm questioning his legitimacy immediately.
It's a shocking disruption of convention, and scholars have spent centuries, literally centuries, trying to figure out the apologetic strategy behind naming Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, who Matthew actually calls the wife of Uriah, and finally Mary.
Now, a lot of people probably grew up hearing the sinner's hypothesis, right?
Very common.
The idea that these women had notorious moral failings, so they are included to show God's grace to unworthy people.
Yeah, but that theory falls apart pretty quickly under scrutiny. I mean, Ruth is explicitly praised in the Hebrew Bible as a woman of noble character.
Right, she's like the ultimate loyal daughter-in-law.
Exactly. And in the story of Tamar, the patriarch Judah confesses that Tamar is actually more righteous than he is. So categorizing them merely as sinners just doesn't fit the textual reality.
What about the other theories?
Well, another theory focuses on irregular unions, suggesting these women were involved in culturally abnormal relationships that preserved the messianic line. And while that helps prepare the reader for the unusual circumstances of Mary's pregnancy, it doesn't really explain why Matthew chose these specific women out of all the unusual stories in Israel's history.
Right. And the essay you provided points to Gentile inclusion as the unifying thread.
Yes. Tamar is tied to Syria-Palestine by ancient writers. Rahab was famously a Canaanite. Ruth was a Moabite. And by designating Bathsheba as the wife of Uriah, Matthew ties her to a Hittite household.
Wow.
He is deliberately pointing to the nations outside of Israel.
But then he gets to Mary, the 5th woman, and the grammar of the entire text shifts. Your notes highlighted this linguistic pivot as a really crucial piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, it's fascinating. For the entire genealogy, Matthew uses the active Greek verb agenesin, meaning fathered. Abraham fathered Isaac, Isaac fathered Jacob, on and on down the line.
We had this standard formula.
But when he reaches Joseph, he breaks the pattern entirely. He shifts to the feminine pronoun hes and the passive verb agenethi, so it translates to Joseph, the husband of Mary, from whom Jesus was born.
Oh, so he restricts the biological origin entirely to Mary.
Exactly.
Protecting the virgin birth narrative while keeping Joseph in the list as the legal father to secure that 14-generation Davidic throne claim.
It accomplishes that perfectly, and it simultaneously defends against intense early rumors that Jesus was born of an illegitimate union. By weaving these specific women into the genealogy, Matthew demonstrates that God has historically superintended irregular, unexpected, and ethnically mixed households to bring about his sovereign purposes.
So he's forcing the critics into a corner.
Oh, yeah. If they want to dismiss Jesus because of the irregularity surrounding his birth, they have to dismiss King David and the entire tribe of Judah, too.
That is brilliant. It also tells the reader that the inclusion of Gentiles in the early Christian movement wasn't some, desperate backup plan because the mission to Israel failed.
Right, it was always the plan.
It was baked into the Abrahamic promise from the beginning that all families of the earth would be blessed. It's literally written into the Messiah's ancestral DNA.
And that ancestral setup leads us directly into the birth narrative, which establishes a massive bookend structure for the entire gospel. Scholars often call it an inclusio.
Because Matthew 1:23 quotes the prophet Isaiah, specifically Isaiah 7:14. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Immanuel, which means God with us.
Right. And to understand the weight of that, we really need to look at the historical context of the 8th century BCE. King Ahaz of Judah was absolutely terrified because a military alliance, the Syro-Ephraimite Coalition, was marching to destroy his kingdom.
Okay, setting the scene.
So the prophet Isaiah gives Ahaz a sign. A young woman will have a son, and before that child is old enough to know right from wrong, your enemies will be vanquished.
So that child was a literal temporary pledge that God was still protecting the house of David.
Exactly. But Matthew takes that historical pledge and completely transforms it. He's saying this historical pattern is dialing up to its ultimate conclusion. Jesus isn't just a temporary sign that God is watching out for us. He is the flesh and blood reality of God stepping down into the dirt to dwell with us.
And that creates our structural bookends. Because the gospel opens in chapter 1 announcing God with us. And then if you jump to the very last verse of the book, Matthew 28:20, the resurrected Jesus tells his followers, I am with you always to the end of the age.
Yes. The entire narrative is bracketed by the localized presence of God.
I noticed a massive contrast here compared to the Gospel of Luke or the book of Acts. Because in those books, you have this dramatic ascension scene where Jesus physically lifts off into the clouds. But in Matthew,
there's nothing like that.
There is no ascension. The book just ends with him saying, I am with you always. It's almost like Jesus is functioning as a mobile temple.
A mobile temple, yes, exactly.
The presence of God isn't stuck behind a heavy curtain in a stone building in Jerusalem anymore. It's out in the world.
That localized walking temple concept is vital, because if Matthew is presenting Jesus as the literal presence of God on earth, that fundamentally changes his authority. He isn't just a wise teacher, which explains why Matthew structures Jesus' actual teachings in such a highly specific, almost rigid way. And this brings us to the core of your notes, the Pentateuchal scaffolding.
This was the part of the deep dive that completely reframed how I see the book. I mean, we really need to focus on this. Matthew's gospel is built around 5 major speeches or discourses.
Yes, and this is where the architecture really shows itself.
So we have the Sermon on the Mount spanning chapters 5 through 7, then the missionary discourse in chapter 10, instructing the 12,
right.
The parable discourse in chapter 13, the community discourse in chapter 18, detailing how this new assembly should handle conflict, and finally, the eschatological discourse in chapters 24 and 25 concerning the end of the age. So that's 5 massive blocks of teaching.
And here's the key. Every single one of them ends with a literary colophon, the exact same phrase. The text says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, 5 distinct teachings, 5 identical concluding markers.
And any first-century Jewish reader would immediately recognize that 5-fold shape, wouldn't they?
Immediately. It directly evokes the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the Mosaic Pentateuch. Matthew is meticulously presenting Jesus as a new, greater Moses, delivering a new Torah to a new community.
It is a massive structural Easter egg. But the comparison to Moses isn't just in the 5 speeches. The narrative surrounding Jesus' early life is essentially the Exodus story.
It really is. Let's look at how the author layers those parallels. King Herod slaughters the innocent Hebrew infants in Bethlehem,
which is an unavoidable mirror to Pharaoh slaughtering the Hebrew baby boys in Egypt.
Exactly. And then Jesus' family flees to Egypt to escape, and Matthew explicitly quotes the prophet Hosea. Out of Egypt I called my son.
Wait, hold on. I'm putting the pieces together from the text. After they come back, Jesus is eventually baptized in the waters of the Jordan River, and then he immediately goes into the wilderness for 40 days of intense testing.
Yes. Crossing the waters of the Red Sea, followed by Israel's 40 years of wandering and testing in the wilderness.
Oh, wow. And then the climax of this entire setup. He climbs up a mountain to deliver the first of those 5 discourses, the Sermon on the Mount. He is literally retracing the historical steps of Moses ascending Mount Sinai to receive the law. But in this version, Jesus is succeeding where the nation of Israel previously failed in the wilderness.
The author is establishing Jesus as the specific figure prophesied in Deuteronomy 18. Moses told the Israelites, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you."
Right.
Through this intricate narrative and structural scaffolding, Matthew is proving that Jesus is that definitive prophet. Moses went up a mountain to receive the law on stone tablets. Jesus goes up a mountain and embodies the law, delivering it directly to the people.
But this creates a massive tension. Because if Jesus is positioned as a new Moses, standing on a mountain, delivering a new 5-part Pentateuch, does that mean he's destroying the old rules? Is he throwing out the original Torah?
That is the exact accusation that was being hurled at early Christians. We really have to look at the socio-historical setting of the late 1st century to understand this.
What was going on then?
Well, the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple in 70 CE, and that created a massive vacuum of leadership and identity, which led to intense intramural debates among Jewish groups about how to move forward.
Everyone trying to figure out what it means to be faithful without a temple.
Exactly. And non-messianic groups looked at Jesus' followers, who were increasingly welcoming Gentiles without requiring them to follow all the traditional purity laws, and they charged them with outright lawlessness. They accused them of abandoning the sacred covenant entirely.
So how does Matthew answer that charge using the text?
Programmatically, in Matthew 5, verses 17 through 20, Jesus explicitly states, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them."
Okay, abolish versus fulfill.
Right. The Greek word for abolished is kataluo, meaning to tear down or invalidate a structure. But the word for fulfill is plerou, meaning to bring something to its intended completeness or full measure. Jesus vehemently rejects the role of a law abolisher.
I have to push back on this a bit, though, on behalf of our listener. Because the very next thing Jesus says is, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah, people struggle with that verse.
It sounds like an impossible bar. If the Pharisees were the ultimate rule followers and Jesus demanding even more rule following, isn't he just setting people up to fail?
It's a common misunderstanding to read it as Jesus adding heavier weights to an already impossible barbell. He isn't raising the bar to crush people. He's exposing a fundamental flaw in how the law was being applied. The Pharisees had reduced the Torah to a manageable external behavioral checklist.
Like saying, I didn't physically murder anyone today, so I get a gold star for keeping the law.
Precisely that kind of external compliance, which often masked deep internal corruption. And Jesus addresses this directly in the Sermon on the Mount through what scholars call the antitheses.
Where he says, you have heard it said, but I say to you.
Exactly. He repeatedly says, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. Now, for a long time, people read those as binary replacements, like throwing away the old law to introduce a brand new one. But closer study reveals they are structured as triads.
Triads. How does a triad work in this context?
It operates in 3 steps. First, Jesus names the traditional command. You have heard that it was said, do not murder. Second, he diagnoses the hidden heart-level trap that makes covenant failure inevitable.
Like the root cause.
Yes. He says that harboring secret anger, contempt, or insulting your brother puts you in the same danger of judgment. He's diagnosing the root cause. Finally, the 3rd step isn't just a higher moral abstraction. He commands a transforming initiative to break the cycle.
Like practical action.
Right. He says, if you remember your brother has something against you, leave your gift at the altar, go and be reconciled, and then come back.
So he isn't replacing the law against murder. He is bringing the law to its intended completeness. He's demanding a heart-deep fidelity rather than just a surface-level checklist.
And that deep fidelity is meant to be empowered by the Holy Spirit. This whole framework expands the family tree rather than chopping it down. Jesus isn't saying his new movement replaces Israel. He is showing that the Gentiles are being grafted into the rich, existing root system of Israel. The promised plan of God is unfolding exactly as it was designed to from Genesis.
When you lay it all out like that, it really changes how you interact with the text. I mean, if we just skip the genealogy because it looks like a boring census, or if we read the Sermon on the Mount just as a list of nice ethical ideas, we completely miss the blueprint.
You miss the whole architecture.
Yeah. By understanding this hidden scaffolding, the math of the 14 generations, the shocking inclusion of those specific Gentile women, the Immanuel bookends, and those 5 massive discourses functioning as a new Pentateuch, we see a highly engineered unfolding promise. A plan where the irregular, the outsiders, and the morally complicated are purposefully woven into the grand design.
It trains the reader to recognize divine architecture inside the messy reality of human history. But, there's one final unexplored nugget from the sources you shared regarding those 5 women in the genealogy that we should probably leave you to mull over.
Oh, the apocalyptic angle. This was arguably the most surprising part of the essay.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. Scholars like Richter and Heiser propose that this genealogy might also operate on an apocalyptic register. They suggest the inclusion of these specific women and the irregular unions they represent might intentionally recall the ancient Enochic Watcher traditions from Genesis 6.
Wait, we're talking about the Nephilim here, right?
Yes.
The ancient Jewish tradition that heavenly beings crossed forbidden boundaries and mated with human women.
Yes. In ancient Jewish literature, those heavenly beings transgressing their appointed boundaries were viewed as the primary root of cosmic corruption and evil in the world. Illicit, forbidden crossings that corrupted the human bloodline.
So if Matthew is deliberately evoking that tradition, what is he trying to say about Jesus?
Well, it raises a really provocative question for you to chew on. What if Matthew's genealogy isn't just making a political or an ethnic statement about Gentile inclusion? What if it is a cosmic statement?
Oh, wow.
What if the Messiah's lineage is deliberately tracing its way through a human history marked by illicit, forbidden, and irregular crossings in order to definitively reverse a cosmic rebellion? He is showing that God takes the very mechanism of ancient corruption, irregular unions, and subverts it to bring about the ultimate salvation of the world.
That completely changes how you look at a simple list of names. It is not just a phone book. It is the front lines of a cosmic war, hidden right there in plain sight on page 1. We are going to leave you to chew on that apocalyptic register. Keep digging into these sources, don't ever skip the Begats, and we'll catch you next time.